I have to make this video under a certain length of time, okay? But always go back and stop and rewind, okay? So geography of ancient Egypt. I'm going to skip through these because these aren't very important right now. All right, on your geography, fill in the blank notes. The first thing we're going to talk about is the Nile River flows north, and it's about 4,000 miles long. And when we think about the way that a river flows, we usually think of it flowing south. That's why the Nile River is different. It flows north. That's because there are mountains in the south, and so the land is higher, so the river flows downhill to the ocean, to sea level. Okay, your map looks a little bit like this, only I think yours is probably cut off right about here, okay? So just kind of beware of that while you're drawing in your locations and labeling your map. Please make sure you're labeling your map and you're including a map key on your map. Okay, so if you'll go ahead and trace the Nile River, notice that we start all the way up here and we trace the squiggly line straight through the middle of Egypt and it branches off underneath Nubia. This square country right here is Egypt. Okay, label the Nile River. Notice your map key. Whatever color you're using for rivers, you need to write rivers and put it in your map key. You also have the White Nile and the Blue Nile. These two rivers converge to form the Nile River. And like I said, this river is the longest river in the world. You can see it from space. We're talking about the uses of the Nile. They use the Nile to travel in order to trade and work. They go from village to village, and they use it to get out to the Mediterranean Sea. Egyptians invented sailboats. They traveled north, which is downstream with the current. And then they traveled upstream with the wind. The wind blows from the north. Now remember, we said that the river flows north. That's because you're coming from the mountains where the land is higher and going down to sea level. That's why it's called downstream, right? And then we're going upstream when the elevation of the earth is getting higher and the wind is coming off of the ocean, so that's why it's blowing from the north. Egypt has natural defenses that help protect it from invaders. The first one is cataracts. Those are fast rapids, and it says cataracts, fast rapids. First natural defense stopped invaders. I know that might be a little hard to see, but that word is invaders, and it kept them from reaching Egypt in the south. Okay, so on your map, just kind of do this in a ballpark range on your map. Cataracts are here and here in the Nile, so somewhere about there on your map should be fine. Don't stress if it's not perfect. All right, the next natural defense is the delta. That's an area of very rich soil. It's the second natural defense. It stopped invaders from the Mediterranean Sea because there were no harbors to dock at. And you can see that the delta is very rich and fertile. This is an image from Google Earth. And the reason it's called a delta is it makes that triangle shape, which is also a Greek symbol, right? And the Greek symbol that is in the triangle shape is called delta, okay? This green area here is very fertile. You can tell the difference between the fertile area and the desert. It's dry, it's brown, there's no life right there. So you've got all this rich soil, kind of a marshy type of land right here at the mouth of the Nile River as it flows into the Mediterranean Sea. So on your map, if you can draw a little triangle up here and shade that in, that's a delta. Don't forget to add it to your map key, your cataracts, and your delta down here. Okay, you're going to color in and label the Mediterranean Sea. I'll give you just a moment to do that. And remember, you can stop and pause as we're going along. I just kind of got to get through this so that it'll load. Okay, the Red Sea is off to the west. Just kidding, the east. It's off to the east. And you may or may not have the Persian Gulf on your map. I don't think that you do, but just in case, color that in and label it as well. Remember, this area right here is the Fertile Crescent. We were just studying this with Mesopotamia. So you can see how close these two countries are. All right, so when does the Nile flood? Well, this is a graph that shows you when the rivers are at their highest. And you can see here as we're going along in May, it's pretty low. We're here at almost 0, maybe 50 cubic meters or millions of cubic meters a day, right? And as we go through the year, June, July, August, and up to September, that's its peak when the rivers flood. And then they recede back down as the year goes on. What happens is the rivers in, the snow and whatever else is on the ground in the mountains in the south, they start to melt because these months are heating up. And so when they melt, all the water starts rushing down the rivers. And when the Blue Nile and the White Nile converge, it's like taking 2 cups of water and pouring it into 1. It's going to overflow. There's not going to be enough room for them. So around September, the Nile floods. Okay, so depending on where you are in Egypt, the Nile floods between June and September. If you live closer to the mountains, which is further south in Egypt, it's going to flood in June. If you live further downstream, all the way in the north near the delta, it's going to flood in September. These are just images of Google Earth. You see on April 28th, 2000, you can see the river here. But look, just in August, just a few months later, look how much wider the blue is on Google Earth's image. That is the Nile River flooding. The same thing's happening here in 2001. In May, the line is much thinner, and then in August, it gets a little bit thicker because the Nile's flooding. There are no levees because the flood was welcomed. Okay, so the flood was predictable, so the Egyptians liked it. See those people right there? They're out there working the fields and their crops. They just let the river flood over the land. The floods were predictable, regular, yearly, and not feared. So that's very different than Mesopotamia because the Mesopotamians feared the floods because those were unpredictable. In Egypt, they liked them and they welcomed them because they were predictable. This is an example of a Nileometer. It's a standard system of measurement that the Egyptians used to measure the height of the flood each year. These marks here on the walls here, that tells the Egyptians how high the flood is, okay? That's what they use to measure it. So again, that's called a Nileometer. There are 3 seasons in Egypt, all based around the flood. You have Akhet, which is the inundation or the flood in Egypt between June and September. Peret, which is the growing season. They planted crops in October or November. And then Shamu, which is the harvest season. That's when they harvested the crops in March or April when the Nile was at its lowest. There's areas of fertile land right near the Nile. So on your map, I want you to just kind of really thinly draw some fertile land on and around the Nile River. It is very distinct in Egypt. You can literally put 1 foot on fertile land and the other foot on desert. That is how hard that line is, or that boundary is. I think I got ahead of myself here. So the Nile River gives very fertile mud where the Nile deposits soil. So when it floods, it leaves behind fertile mud, or what they like to call hoppy. But you can literally stand 1 foot on fertile land and 1 foot in the desert, just as I said before. So you can see, this picture here is really good to see that. So you see the green growing land there, but then all of a sudden there's the dry desert. So you can literally, kind of like going to Carowinds and standing in South Carolina and North Carolina at the same time. That's how distinct the line is between the desert and the fertile land. You can even see it here. This is an image from Google Earth. So all of this green is the fertile land. On either side of it is desert. Okay, so what surrounds Egypt? I just said it. Deserts. Deserts. The third natural defense is deserts, because they surround Egypt. So we've talked about 3 natural defenses. One's the cataracts, 2 is the delta, and the third one is the deserts. So on your map, you're going to color in the desert. Okay? Don't forget to put them in your map key. Whatever color you choose for deserts, that's what you're doing. And you need to label your deserts. It's important to know which desert is where out there in Africa. So you have the Sahara Desert, the Arabian Desert, the Nubian Desert. They kind of run into each other and overlap, so just do your best to guess where they start and stop. The Negev Desert. And then in the Arabian Peninsula, which is right underneath the Fertile Crescent where we were studying Mesopotamia. Okay, so there's natural protection all around. Natural protection all around. So, there's not a lot of different empires because you didn't have people wanting to cross 2 or 3 deserts to get to Egypt. You didn't have people trying to go across the cataracts down here in the south. It was too dangerous, right? They didn't have the technology to do that yet. And then coming in from the Mediterranean Sea, there's no harbor. Ships couldn't come in. They'd get stuck in the swampy marsh of the delta. So they were pretty well secure all around. So they only had the one empire in Egypt. This is just a chart similar to that in Mesopotamia about the temperatures and stuff. Egypt was very similar in their precipitation. See here, 0, 0. That's Mesopotamia. This is Egypt, right? This is Rock Hill, all around the same time of the year. So you can see that the precipitation is very different. So Egypt also had a hot and dry desert climate. Egypt had an irrigation method. They dug basins for the floods to fill so that the water would kind of pool up and they could use it. They dug canals from the basins to the fields so the water would kind of trickle in like you would in a river or creek. And then they used this cool gadget here called a shadoof. That's fun to say. Shadoof, right? In your textbook, it's spelled S-H-A-D-O-O-F. But on a lot of other places, you'll see it spelled just like this. But the shadoof was used to get water out of the Nile River. This end was weighted, and this is the end that has a basket in it. So they pull the lever down, because this is on a lever. They pull the lever down, and then they let the weight pull the water back up. And then they'll put it in these little cans here and carry them back to where they need them. The main crops in Egypt were flaxseed, wheat, and barley. So very similar to Mesopotamia. They also grew this reed plant called papyrus. It grew in the delta and was used to make baskets, mats, and paper.